Next, we have an article at TonyOrtega.org by Tony Ortega entitled, "When L. Ron Hubbard Briefly Let Down His Guard and Admitted That Scientology Was All a Con." And here is an excerpt from Fair Game, recounting an encounter with Hubbard. At the time, Hubbard was bouncing between Mediterranean ports aboard his ship, the Royal Scotsman. Nairn worked out through marine radio channels that Hubbard had dropped anchor in the Tunisian city of Bizerta. Who is Nairn? Okay, let's take a look. No, we don't want to see that. Nairn, the name of some guy. Charlie Nairn filmed Granada Television's World in Action documentary, The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard. So he investigated Hubbard. Charlie Nairn. The World in Action crew hot-footed it to North Africa. When they arrived, Nairn headed straight for the docks. It was after midnight, and the filmmaker was alone. He looked up at the Scientology ship and saw the outline of an older man in a captain's hat smoking away. Nairn was sure it was Hubbard and decided to try his luck. Quote, "I went up the gangplank, up to the bridge. He was alone. I said hello. I made my excuses, told him I wasn't a Scientologist like all those sleeping innocently below, but that I was a young filmmaker fascinated by the process of inventing a religion. Immediately he seemed interested, intrigued. There was absolutely no whiff of 'What are you doing on my ship?' I remember telling him about why I was interested in this. About my mother. According to Nairn, Hubbard was undeterred by the provocative premise of his interest in him. He welcomed the conversation, and the pair talked for over an hour. The filmmaker asked why Hubbard invented Scientology. As around 200 Scientologists slept in their bunks on the Royal Scotsman, he gave Nairn an answer he could never have uttered if his followers were awake. He said, according to Nairn, it started out purely as a way to make money. The whole thing was just a con, very simply, with 200 or whatever it was Scientologists innocently sleeping just below us." End quote. As the conversation developed, Hubbard told Nairn that making a buck was not the only motivating factor. He did say that although the initial thing was money, he had also become fascinated by catching people, especially clever people, at luring them in. Recalls Nairn, quote, "I remember him saying it reminded him of fishing with his father. You cast out your line to fool a beautiful silvery fish. That was the whole fun of it, and tricking it, and luring it in, deceiving it." Hubbard explained to Nairn that as a child, he and his father made fishing flies and lures together, experimenting with what would work and what wouldn't. According to Nairn, Hubbard said, "I never understood why a beautiful fish could be caught by a fake fly." End quote. Hubbard was admitting his life's work was, like fly fishing, all about camouflage and deception. Hubbard mused about how intelligent people got caught up in Scientology. Nairn says, "I remember him specifically talking about 2 medical doctors who got involved in Scientology as if they should have known better. I remember a sense of triumph from him over this idea, as if he felt some of his victims were maybe brighter than he was, but that they were needy, gullible, that he understood the human animal and its needs, its exploitable needs." End quote. But a sense of triumph was not all that Nairn got from Hubbard. Quote, "I also got a feeling of someone who didn't actually seem to have much self-confidence, who was boosted by the respect and reverence that people he thought more intelligent than he were prepared to pay him. And I'd say there was a funny mixture of triumph over his victims, but then, once caught, a lack of respect for them. And now I wonder if that was what he ultimately could not stand. And so all those later stories of his towering rages, did he hate his victims? I got that feeling pretty strongly." End quote. As their late-night conversation continued, on the bridge of the Royal Scotsman, Nairn put forward his idea of why intelligent people were so easily conned. Quote, "It's because you're filling up the God-shaped hole," Nairn told him. It must have been a confronting conversation for Hubbard. A young upstart filmmaker turns up unannounced and wants to ask provocative questions about how he invented a religion and how he was conning all those sleeping below deck. Nairn says at no point did Hubbard argue with him or shout at him or ask him to leave. What he absolutely didn't say is, quote, "No, that's not what I'm doing, you haven't understood." He never said, "You have not understood," end quote. Charlie Nairn felt Hubbard wanted to keep talking about the very topic you would least expect him to want to discuss with a documentary maker. Quote, "He settled down in relief, finally able to talk to someone about inventing a religion and conning people, and I'd now say the trap he found himself almost intolerably stuck in," says Nairn. A thought nagged away at the young filmmaker as Hubbard expanded on the theme. Quote, I could well understand hopping into bed at night with one's wife, rubbing one's hand together and saying, "We made 10K today, dear," says Nairn, but I could not understand his own wife believing it all. Believing in out-of-body experiences and previous lives. I couldn't imagine lying in bed with someone who believed my con, and being surrounded all the time by only believers. All those people sleeping peacefully below. Nairn asked Hubbard whether he felt trapped, whether his situation made him feel lonely. Quote, that's when he said, very slowly and with a smile I can remember still, that was his first interesting question he'd been asked in 20 years, end quote. Nairn thought he had hit the jackpot. Not only had he tracked down the elusive Hubbard in a remote port, he had got him to talk openly about the topic Nairn was so desperate to make a film about. He asked Hubbard if he would be interviewed on camera. Hubbard agreed. Nairn went away and woke up his film crew. By the time they had returned, it was around 3 a.m. But the mood, the entire scenario, had shifted significantly. There were now around 30 Scientologists surrounding Hubbard. He could not repeat the kinds of things he had been so happy to talk about just hours earlier. Nairn says they were standing behind me, getting edgy whenever I pushed Hubbard. I did try asking him the first interesting question I've been asked in 20 years again, but it didn't work. He was back in front of the conned, so therefore back in his own trap, end quote.